Hey YouTube, welcome back. This is not a build guide. This is not really something that I would recommend you spending your time on. However, I do think there's lots of things we can learn from this particular build and how we can build characters and how we can even build Last Epoch in the future. Developers, I'm talking to you. So as a new player, I've played lots of builds that were not particularly good. And as an experienced player, I continue to play builds that are not particularly good. Sometimes you're playing something like melee crit Cinder Strike. Sometimes you're playing Fire Aura, maybe you're playing Acid Flask, or maybe you're playing crit melee damage Mana Strike. In this particular scenario, we're doing a build that's very much so similar to that, but we could even give it a name because it performs at the bare minimum of what I would even call a build. But this would be like Death by 1,000 Cuts Mana Strike. So what we're doing with this particular build is we are taking a damage type and a archetype that has almost literally no more multipliers. So one of the big things that's an issue for skills that are kind of noob traps that new players enjoy playing, but they can't seem to get enough damage for endgame is they don't have more multipliers to them. So it's nice to look at a skill tree, type in Control F more, Control F multiplier, Control F multiplicative, and see what kinds of multipliers are available to you before you start building your character. But you might not know to do that. So that leads you to builds that look like this. We have pushed this build not quite to the max, but we have some good gear to go along with it, and it does take about 200k damage on the dummy. If you've been in conversations talking about ailment builds in the past, first of all, you know that ailments got nerfed relatively recently, but a build that does 200k ticks to the dummy, it's not DPS, it's ticks, that is about the bare minimum for what an ailment build ought to be doing to the dummy in town. And as it turns out, we can clear 200, 300 corruption with this build. I don't know how much more than that we can do, but it's a functional build once you have a whole bunch of gear for it. It's not a functional build. It's 1,000 different bleeds, over 1,000 bleeds, maybe 1,500 bleeds, but none of them have any multiplicative damage on top of that. So they're all very, very small. So let's talk about what this build is, why we put it together, and what we can learn from this particular build. We have some interesting defenses that go along with it. We've got some interesting build ideas, but at the end of the day, this is not a build guide. I do not recommend playing this character. Play at your own risk. So why are we playing this character? We were part of a build contest recently. We, in collaboration with Aaron Action RPG and Vision GL, two other Twitch streamers who have excellent Last Epoch communities, we did a Builds of Power contest. So that just wrapped up for us, and we were Team Gone. And for Team Gone, we wanted to ask people, what can you do as long as you have a Gone rune, a lightning rune in your invocation here? So I kind of fudged the rules for myself, but I didn't submit my own build. It's okay. Because I'm never actually casting my ball lightning. My initial idea was to use Mana Strike along with the Mental Catalysis node. Oh, sorry, not this one. Along with the Edict of the Scion node. It counts as an area skill because it hits an AoE. And it gives us 36 times 3, so 108 ward per right click. And you can see that we actually generate quite a bit of ward while we are smacking our enemies, especially if we're smacking 2 or 3 enemies at the same time. To add on to that, we also are generating ward from Frostclaw that's hitting things. We are generating ward from Mana Strike, and we're generating ward from pretty much just from Edict of the Scion. There's another haste sub-theme here, but we'll get to that point. So the idea for the build was, what if we could generate a bunch of ward and then consume that ward using a Symbol of Demise, which would turn it into bleed chance up to 200. It's a hard cap on bleed chance, but it's an uncapped increase to your bleed duration. So on single target, you'll see that we can generate, I guess for single target, we swap weapons, but we'll get to that too. For single target, you'll see that we can generate maybe about 3,000 ward, not much more than 3,000 ward. And 3,000 ward gives us about 239 stacks. So that's maybe like a 9 or a 10-second bleed instead of the normal 3-second bleed. So that's a pretty cool bleed duration. 9 or 10-second bleed is pretty bad for normal monsters, but we'll talk about this item down here in just a moment. On AoE, when we're clearing monsters, if we're hitting a whole bunch of monsters at the same time and we're teleporting around, there's big packs of monsters, and we don't instantly kill things, so sometimes we have a big pack of monsters around us. We have topped out at 15,000 ward, and 15,000 ward, when you consume all of that with a Symbol of Demise, first of all, it goes back down to 0, so you can't really use it for defenses, but we're generating it pretty quickly. That 15,000 ward turns into approximately a 30-second bleed duration. So you can either wait for 30 seconds for the monsters to die, or you can use the other piece of the puzzle here. So I've done a build contest in the past using Taste of Blood, and that build contest actually turned into like a Taste of Blood / Symbol of Demise contest because so many people were pairing these two items together. So to make up for the fact that we have quite literally no more multipliers in Mana Strike, we have the base hit, we have a Spark Charge, and we have the Mana Arc over here. So we have 3 separate hits, but no more multipliers. We have Frost Claw that's being procced at a 30% chance. We technically have a 20% more multiplier. It's a pretty big number. And we technically have a 6%, which sometimes gets doubled to 12% more multiplier, but it's only happening 30% of the time. We basically have no more multipliers in this build, but we do have lots and lots of small hits. So combining these two items means that every time that we're punching an enemy, we are halving the duration on a bleed and doubling its damage. So we're making it happen faster. It doesn't change our damage, it just makes it happen faster. So we can clear monoliths with a Taste of Blood. We have one here with tier 7 bleed on hits, which is really what you want because you want as much % chance to bleed as possible. And then for single target damage, because we're assuming that a single target boss is going to take more than 9 seconds, we'd rather just swap over to something like this, which has about a 130% chance to bleed on hit instead of just the 90 over here. And then it also has some extra melee attack speed. So it's interesting trying to use these things to juice up as much damage as possible. The rest of the build, we have this haste sub-theme going on. It helps us to generate even more ward. I will show you about how much ward we can generate. So punching all these monsters, like 3,000, maybe 4,000. Punching all these monsters here, 3,000, 4,500 ward, like this. 4,600 ward. If I take off these boots, you'll see that my boots have intelligence on them, but the most importantly have that affix that says, when you gain haste, you gain 33 ward. So taking a look at this, let's see how much ward we can generate now. That's like 2,000, 2,100, 2,100. Can I get much more than 2,100? Not much more than that. About 2,000 at that point. So we lost the ward retention from the intelligence, but we also lose that haste on hit. And we've talked about this in a matter of other builds too. You can use Quicksilver Coils to have some melee attack speed, which benefits us, but it also gives us a chance to gain haste on hits, along with Wing Guards, giving us a chance to gain haste on hit. So this extra ward generation feeds into Symbol of Demise. It's a little bit of defense because we lose the ward every once in a while, but it feeds into this and it helps us get even more ward to turn into bleed duration, which gives us damage. So that's like all the moving pieces of this build. For our bleed chance, we have 200% bleed chance from the Symbol of Demise. Whatever bleed chance happens to be on your weapon, be it LP or normal. And then we also have Valdir's Chalice, which I think is important here because Valdir's Chalice gives us Leech, and we do want Leech because we're basically a health build that just happens to have a little bit of ward every once in a while. We have Thornslinger giving us another 46% chance to bleed on hits. It has a bunch of life on it because, again, we're basically a life-based character who happens to have ward every once in a while. You've heard people talk about class affixes. Class affixes are a great way of juicing up your damage. So you could put like plus levels to Mana Strike. You could do more damage. You could do increased fire damage over time. Those sorts of class affixes that only roll on your helmet, on your body armor, and on your relic. For us, because we're playing a unsupported archetype, we don't have class affixes that are particularly good for us. We could use something like this that has intelligence and health on it, but that's about it. So what we get to use our prefixes for on our body armor and on our helmet is to round out a different layer of defense that kind of goes along with this. So we know that there was a big change in 092 to how damage taken from mana before health works. Damage taken from mana before health used to work beneficially with endurance threshold. So there's this entire defensive build archetype where you could build as little health as possible, as much endurance threshold as possible, and then a whole bunch of damage taken from mana before health. Maybe like 60, 70, or even 80% damage taken from mana before health. Because when it was sent to your mana, it was also mitigated by the endurance. That no longer functions, so we've been asking ourselves, what happens with the affix damage taken from mana before health? And what you could do is just use it alongside some kind of mana engine or a bunch of mana regeneration to mitigate a little bit of damage along with other layers of defense. So instead of being a primary layer of defense, it's just like, it's something that augments the rest of your build. So for us, I at one point I had it in 2 places. Currently I only have it in 1 place, but you could have up to like 25-ish. You could have even more than that if you get it in 2 places, like exalted modifiers. But damage taken from mana before health does work quite well with this character, because we have some ward some amount of the time. We have flame ward, which gives us like a nice layered defense, and all these less damage taken modifiers as well. We can even take the flame ward to give us extra armor over here. But how else do we remain tanky if we're not using something like Cold Fire Cold for our runic invocation? Why are we not using Cold Fire Cold? Because we were part of the Team Lightning build contest, and we wanted to have lightning stuff above our head, and Cold Fire Cold notably does not have a lightning thing above our head. In any case, so we have damage dealt to mana before health. We're a life-based build, but we're also a damage taken from mana before health build using Mana Strike, allowing us to refund some of our mana as we attack. If we wanted even more refund, we could grab these nodes on the bottom right side of the Mana Strike skill tree, because these do not get diminished by the Teleporting Strikes node here. And then we also have chance to gain Lightning Aegis when hit. It's cool to have all these separate layers of defense. We're not able to use our prefixes for damage like you normally would. So getting Lightning Aegis pretty consistently because monsters are hitting us because we're not killing them very fast. Getting damage taken from mana before health and using that alongside, 3,000 health here and having Mana Strike refunding mana for us. And then if we get chunked, if Symbol of Demise consumes all of our ward and we get chunked, we still get to generate more ward while we also leech back some of our health or regenerate some of our health or even potion back some of our health. So the defense of this build were pretty interesting. CFC, thank you Twitch chat, CFC also notably breaks and no longer gives you defenses when you hit 0 ward. So CFC, along with Symbol of Demise, which eats all of your ward, not a good idea. I thought this out. I promise I thought this out. All right, so those are a couple things going on in this build. Again, not a build guide, but it's more of a build discussion. What you could do to try to juice up even more damage in this build is use Salt the Wound. So Salt the Wound is an item that I think kind of fell from grace after the ailment nerf, but let's bring it up here so we can see it. Salt the Wound allows us to convert added critical strike multiplier, not the base 200, but added critical strike multiplier into physical penetration with bleed. So currently we only have a tiny bit of bleed from our, like a tiny bit of bleed here, and then armor shred from the Age of Winter Blessing. And it's a pretty small armor shred amount, particularly against bosses. So you'll see that even on my amulet, I have some extra physical penetration here to try to get a little bit better damage against bosses. So what would Salt the Wound do? It gives you better penetration. It allows you to build critical strike multiplier and scale your gear in a way that you wouldn't normally be able to scale your gear, because crit multi doesn't normally do anything for a damage over time bleed build. So I like the idea of Salt the Wound. It would be like the more min-maxed version of this, I suppose. I don't think you should min-max this, but we can talk about it. You would lose the haste from your gloves, so you wouldn't be generating as much ward with Advent of the Erased. However, you could put like tier 7 melee attack speed on this to make up for the lost melee attack speed. And then the crit multi, you don't get any crit multi from your gear. You could try to use a wand and use inscribed instruments. I really do not recommend that, but that's something that you could try to do to get some free quote-unquote crit multi along with this. But you have a base type for your body armor that has crit multi on it. Your offhand catalyst, you could do damage over time. There is no second prefix that's good for you. Cast speed, we don't cast anything, but if you really wanted to, you could have your second prefix be crit multi. And then all of a sudden, damage over time and crit multi, all of a sudden you have 2 prefixes that help your build instead of just 1 prefix that helps your build. And the crit multi feeds into Salt the Wound. For my blessings, you'll see that from the end of time, I have a Void Res blessing here. And this could be crit multi. So you would have 1, 2, 3 sources of crit multi along with the crit multi that's on Salt the Wound themselves. You get like just a little bit of crit multi scaling, and then you turn that into physical penetration. It's something that you could do. What's interesting, I suppose, is if you went that route, maybe you look for a different source of ward generation because you're already giving up 1 source of haste. You could even try to do Blood of the Exile, which is a brand new pair of boots added to the game this patch, which gives you more physical ailment damage if the enemies are moving, if they're chasing you, for example. And like you get less ward generation, but the ward generation is only good because it gives you bleed duration. And this has bleed duration on it. So there's a lot of moving pieces. And it's an interesting build. It was fun to mess around with this and think about all the different combinations of items that, at the end of the day, really don't do much in terms of making this a functional... It's a functional character. Of making this a good character. Again, I'm pretty impressed that we can just slap together some items, have 0 more multipliers across the rest of our build. We're really forcing something that basically shouldn't exist. But we still have 200k damage ticks on the dummy when we're using our Dragon Bone Axe here. And of course, it's hard to get good ticks on this because you're actually dealing damage. You're not just ramping up the duration because you're doubling the damage all the time with this thing. So it's been a fun experiment. We're not going to play this for too much longer, but I wanted to show off what we are doing for this build contest because I thought it had a lot of interesting talking points and moving pieces trying to assemble this build. If you have been working on stuff like this in the past, I know I have. Real quickly, as an anecdote, when I was a brand new player, if I saw a build like this, I would think it's so cool. Like, look at this. We got so many small hits. Every right click is 3 small hits because we have Spark Charge here, with the Mana Arc here, and the Mana Strike itself. And all those small hits all stacking up the bleeds. And you'll see real quickly on the dummy, we can get like 300, 400, 500, 600, 700, 800. Oh my God. 999 plus. It's so many bleeds. How could it possibly be bad? Well, when you have 1,000 stacks of bleed or so and no scaling and no more multipliers, it's just the bare minimum of okay. But as a new player, a couple years ago when I started playing Last Epoch, I would have thought that that's pretty cool. So maybe someone else out there sees this build project and is also inspired to some kind of greatness. We'll call it that, okay? So that's the build. We're going to move on to something else, but I want to show off this build while it's still fresh in my mind. If you're playing weird builds, whether they're good or whether they're bad, let me know because I always like hearing about how that journey is for people. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next time.